Okay, good morning. Welcome back to the second day of the More is Different conference. I hope you had a good first day. Exciting talks, more exciting talks are coming for the second and third day. And this morning we have with us Professor Atsushi Iriki from the Riken Brain Science Institute. Professor Iriki received his PhD in neuroscience from the Tokyo Medical and Dental University, and since then he has moved on from various faculty positions, and right now he is a senior team leader at the Riken Brain Science Institute since 2004. And I guess I am a physicist, so you must be wondering why a physicist is introducing a neuroscientist. And I guess the story goes back to last year, last March, when we had a smaller meeting, a smaller workshop between the NTU complexity community, people from Santa Fe, and also Professor Iriki, who came from Riken. And there I heard a captivating talk about his research on a primate, cognition, and how they actually learn to use tools. And since then, the NTU complexity community has started up a brain study group, and we are holding a workshop this Thursday afternoon. And we would actually very much like to engage Professor Iriki to actually forge the directions that we should take to go ahead. But today, our paths cross again, so let me just not waste time anymore and give the floor to Professor Iriki.
Thank you very much for kind introduction, and thank you very much, Jan, for inviting me and bringing me here to Singapore again. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce some of my studies. As being introduced, I'm studying on primates, and what I'm interested in is how brain became bigger. It's more neural resources to our brain and make evolution of us. So the more resources, more new functions, and that changed the environment and how these interact with each other, and try to illustrate the concrete scientific mechanisms that brought us to this level today. So my title is The Brain at the Interface of Evolution, which I have just talked, and society really matters because the society is something, our brain composed the society, and society makes a pressure to our brain to change it. And the mechanisms I would like to finally introduce you is a concept of triadic niche construction. This is something new in my career, and I just published this paper last month. So I'm trying to convince you what the triadic niche construction is. Briefly, triadic is, the niche construction is a concept that the piece of the resources devoted to some living organisms. Usually it is to represent ecological niches, the kinds of the foods that animals eat. And I apply this concept to the other two domains, which is the neural niche, the pieces of the neural tissues that's devoted to those one functions. And another niche, I named it a cognitive niche. This is our mental functions emerged from the brain, which became bigger. And so these three kind of niches interact with each other to create the new or novel environment and novel species, hopefully, which is the evolution. And these are very, the more makes the difference, and this emerges the new field, and this is all path dependent. I think this have the characteristics of the complexity systems. So before getting too long, I would like to start with my old findings that the Japanese macaques, which is a new old world monkey, can be trained to use tools, although they never use them in the wild forest. But they can use tools, and also they can use video camera, and scenery here is projected onto the video monitor here, and they can use it as if playing the video game. And this training takes about 2 weeks. And it's not a long period for monkeys to acquire these new skills. And probably this is the reason why our kids are crazy at playing video game. as a primate brain, we have a precursor of this function, although it's not used in that way. But since it is useful for one particular technology, we can immediately adapt it, reusing the existing old function to the new functions. And these kind of things are probably the clue of the evolution, that's why I suspect. So since this is some spot superimposed in the monitor, monkey thinks that if something is there, he tried to take it. And what is a neural substrate subserving this function? We have been recording, I'm a neurophysiologist by training. I have been recording in the parietal cortex. This is the left side view of our brain. And this is a somatosensory cortex, visual cortex, auditory cortex, and parietal cortex sits in between to integrate various kinds of informations to form the new concept. Well, I'll come back to this point later. But in this, when we insert electrode, although this is a human brain, insert electrode into the monkey parietal cortex, we found bimodal neuron, which integrate somatosensory and visual informations. And I don't get into the detail of the physiology data. It's so boring to you probably. So I just show you in a cartoon by using this as a cartoon which represents the concrete actual data. So when I record one single neural activity from the parietal cortex, sits here, we can drive the neuron by touching the palm of skin surface of the hand. So this spatial territory in the peripheral or external space that give rise to particular neural substrate is called receptive field. So this neuron have the somatosensory or tactile receptive field at the surface of the hand. And at the same time, when we ask the monkey to sit quietly and put a hand on the table and scan the space around it with some particular probe, then this neuron fires. The fires means we use this term when the neuron gives a spike discharge or activated. This neuron fires when this probe approaches closer to the hand, although it's not touching it. So this is the visual responses created by something, visual information related to the space around the hand. So if you scan the field like this, the neuron fires like burp, 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 something like this. And I just showed the visual receptive field by this pink area. And if you move the hand, of course the tactile receptive field is stick to the skin, and also the visual receptive field follows or like moves like anchored to the tactile receptive field. So this neuron integrates information about the hand and also the location and movement of the hand in the space. And this is termed body image or body schema. It's a conventional concept that's brought up about a century ago by neurologists. But at that time, they didn't know the neural substrate subserving it. But we found that parietal neurons of the monkeys initially coding the image of the hand. What happens when he uses the rake is that this receptive field extends along the rake, along the tool, which means our introspection when using the tool like this is we feel like our hand was extended along the tool, or vice versa, tool is incorporated into our body image. So these neural properties represent our introspection, that we can modify our image or of our given innate body. So this gives the rise to the flexibility that non-human animals probably never have, but it could be used as using the tool. But probably, my guess is that neurons in the brain is very adaptive, flexible to the change in the environment. In non-human animals, they don't change the environment in purpose, but they accept the change that happened in the environment. So what this is for, is my speculation is that we grow, our body become bigger. So the neural substrate that control our body movement or body image have to be flexible, have a fringe outside the actual body configurations. But since by grabbing the tool, it happened immediately, but it was within the range of that plasticity. That's why we can utilize this capacity to use the tool. that was accidental benefit that the neural substrate had, but it happened to be useful. So these kind of unexpected usefulness might trigger the evolution. When the principle of the body structure of biology is that when something is useful and used frequently, it put more resources onto that particular function. For the muscles, if you train the muscle, it's become bigger and stronger. This is the physical changes. But even the neurons in the brain, this is just it's special, but it's just an organ, one of the organs of the body. So we can put more resources. That I think is reasonable. And this more resources give rise to emergence of the new function. That's the story I would like to tell you for the rest of my talk. And then this is the receptive field elongated along the two. And when monkey used the video monitor, this receptive field is formed in the monitor. If you scan the spot in the monitor, this neuron also fires, meaning that this represents our introspection, that our body is projected onto the distant monitor. So this also never happens in animals, but can be utilized. And this is the reason why we project ourselves into some other things. And this is a very interesting capacity. And I call this an active representation of the body. It's useful for movement, and this is iconic or visual representation of the body. And this all handled in the parietal cortex. But once, as I told you, these trainings needs about a week for each step. You cannot skip it, or it cannot be very short. In monkeys, in humans, we can, and the baby can do immediately when they reach some certain ages. But monkey needs a training. And after monkey acquire these skills, utilizing perhaps the parietal cortical mechanisms, then could be trained easily, or they can adapt easily at once to combine the different kinds of tool to attain their purposes. This was a very immediate step. Once acquired a basic skill, it was easier for them to combine it. And we cannot skip the basic step. If you expose the monkey immediately to this environment, they cannot use it. But after acquired a basic skill in the parietal cortex, they can utilize those mechanisms to achieve this behavior. And by PET imaging, we detected that to combine this function, in addition to parietal cortex, need the prefrontal functions. That's something added on top of the basic function. We put more resources. So putting together, this means that by about 2 weeks of training, monkey can acquire more emergent functions by more neurons. And during this training, we found, this is our old study, there's one sort of the gene expression in this particular area of the brain, which probably give rise to some modification in the neural circuitry. And later, we found that some connections, intercortical connections, that connects to different cortical areas, the axons or wiring of the between the neurons extends a little bit, accompanying this gene expression. And we initially found that neurons in the higher visual center project to the vicinity of the, if I have time, I can explain in more detail. But this is an area of the cortex. It's cut down this sulcus and looked from the side of the cortex. And this is the area we found those bimotor neurons from. And to this area, in the naive monkey, they don't have a projection from this area, which is higher visual area, providing the visual input to the parietal cortex. It's not reaching to this area. But after the training, they elongate their axons or wiring a slightly little bit, like a few hundred microns or 1 or 2 millimeters at most, toward this area and form the new connections, enabling these neurons to modify their connectivity. So metaphorically, these form the new connection or connect the new different between the different cortical locations by just a little bit of changes of the axonal connections, and that make a big differences. So by doing this, we can modify the monkey's brain function. As I told you, our human way of understanding things developed from the birth to maturity. And this is proposed by educational psychologist Jerome Bruner a long time ago. But they say, he said that when at birth, humans understand the things by touching it or licking it or through their actions. This is called enactive representation. And the monkey receptive field elongation along the rake, I thought this corresponds to this function. And after they become, the humans become the kid, we acquired a visual representation, like chair. When the baby understands what the chair is, they climb on it and lick on it, touch on it, understand how it is. But when they become the elementary school children, they can view the chair and immediately understand it. And after acquired this visual information, they can rotate it and get it back, and they can understand it as its appearance. And the monkey receptive field in the video monitor probably correspond to this visual image. And after get maturity, we can explain about a chair by this function of materials or structure. That's kind of symbolic representation. Probably correspond precursorily to the combination of the tools that I just showed you. So they have structures, and they have to go one by one. And what I want to point here is that this has been claimed to correspond to different species. The human adult have symbolic representation that some of us can become a philosopher. And apes sometimes use tools, but not more than that. They don't have language, they don't have logical thoughts too much. And monkeys never use tools in the wild, and they don't have a mirror self-recognition and so on. So it's inferior to the apes. That's general understanding. But I think what I have showed is by training, we can modify these correspondences. And by the way, we heard about the tool evolution of the tools yesterday morning, from the forms of the Old One artifact to Mysterian motif and so on. And roughly, I thought this corresponds to Old One artifact. This is just a crack of the stones, and it extends our motor functions to crack the hard nuts or something. And this could be made by having this enactive representation. And 500,000 later, we developed a Schulian artifact, which have a similar shapes, but different materials and different way of cracking. At that time, our ancestors must have had a visual image of the tool and cracked the tool until it reaches that shape, which is the visual representation. And after the Neanderthal developed the Mysterian artifact, they have complicated structures and complicated way of making it. It needs some combinatory representation of the things or logics, and this might represent it. And the question here is that if our brain expands so quickly, why this stayed for millions of years as it is? But probably there have some mechanisms that accelerated our evolution. Something happened between this. And I come back to this point later. But here, I would like to propose that the one-to-one relation between the age of the human development and different species abilities of different primate species must be revised. And taking this axis as a very simplified, oversimplified level, describing level of the human intelligence, the human intelligence, N stands for normal human, could be described as a spectrum along this axis from enactive to symbolic representation. The normal human are born at this level, and through the development and education, we can become philosopher, as we described earlier. And in contrast, monkeys in the W stands for wild. Wild monkey, normal monkey, born at this level, and through the development, they can extend, or develop to this level, which corresponds to the human baby, and somehow they stop there, because probably it's not needed, or somehow reasons. But by the training, we can expand this spectrum to incorporate the tool usability and perhaps symbol manipulation. I doubt if the monkey can become a philosopher, but anyway, to some extent, we can expand it, although artificially. And this would induces this overlap of the human brain function, higher cognitive function, and the trained monkey brain function. And with using the monkey, we can do natural science or biology of the human intelligence. So that is what I'm aiming at. And the tool use seems to be the clue, one of the clues that expand this function. There might be alternative possibility, but through the evolution, probably this had happened. And the tool use introduced many interesting behavior in monkeys. I don't have enough time to describe all of that, but they can start imitation, which monkeys never do. The English term imitation is aping, right? But in Japanese, we call it monkey imitation, because we had a natural monkey in Japanese islands, but actually monkey do not imitate. But after the training, they start like sort of imitation. And also the trained monkey can acquire the mirror self-recognitions and joint attention and meta self-recognition. I don't have time to explain all about this. And this will change ecological structure of their society or relationship. And what I want to introduce here is another aspect that each steps of development changes ecology is this. I started out from training the monkey to use external hand or rake, extension of the motor apparatus. And perhaps if you look at the literature, existing literature in the world that's dealing about the tools, the definition of tool is often external object grabbed by the hand and the internal interact with other objects in the nature. That's one kind of a tool. But if you think about what kind of the tool we are using, there's not only the extension of the motor apparatus. We can use a tool that extends our sensory organs, like a radio detector or binoculars or endoscope, whatever. That's extended by sensory apparatus. These kind of the tools are never used in the wild non-human animals. But we thought we can train the monkey to use this kind of sensory, external sensory organs, or more specifically externalized eye, which is an endoscope that the physicians, or gastro camera that the physicians uses. And we have trained the monkey to use endoscope for years and years. Well, it's actually about 4 years, but they could not train them. And there was a question, but then I suddenly came to mind that this might have a structure, step by step built, the next step built into the next step. And then we trained the monkey, which is already trained to use the rake, and attach the piece of the mirror at the tip of the rake, and ask the monkey to get the food, which is hidden behind the hump of the table. And surprisingly, this was a very easy step for monkey to do. Monkey can explore from with the mirror, and he can easily take it. So this is not an externalized eye, but on the tip of the modified body schema, we attached some sensory cues. So after monkey acquired ability to modify their body image, there's a small step that can go farther. And this was the sensory cue. And after acquired monkey acquired this skill, there are step-by-step structure. We first separated the sensory rake with a motor rake. And monkey now look for the food with this sensory rake, which just have a mirror, and he cannot take the food with it. And we found it, he asked for the motor rake and take it. And this was another easy step that we could train the monkey to acquire. And after that, finally we wanted the monkey to use a gastro camera, so we wanted the monkey to get used to this technology, which is a joystick, moved mirror, and then use a rake. And there's several steps that you introduced. This is another step. And then let the monkey to get used to the video monitor, where monkeys are groping under the table with some rake, which has a transparent plate with a camera attached to the tip. So it's very close to the gastro camera. And monkey cannot see the scenery directly, but only through this monitor. And finally, monkey were able to use endoscope like this. This is the scenery, just monkeys are just looking, and this is a view from the front. And monkey now can externalize his eyes. So this is his own eye externalized to the camera and controlled by the hand. So now, I think a monkey acquired how to externalize his own eye and control it outside our innate organs. And what happens? The next question is, what happens when you look yourself by your externalized own eye? This is third person view of yourself, or a precursor of the meta-self-recognition, which is also difficult for humans to attain. We need the training, mental training to do that. But which brain areas are responsible for this? And we did some human fMRI study. And the trick is this. The subject, this is the human subject viewing this scenery, the three person throwing a ball at each other, from the hinder view of this black person, or lateral or side view, or black person's eyeball view, or top view. So there's four sceneries that looking at these three persons throwing the ball at each other. And what we ask the subject to do is, in one condition, we ask the subject to press a button when he saw the red person throwing the ball to the blue person, and press a button at the top of the trajectory. When you ask the subject to do this, he feels like he is looking from the side, three different persons throwing the ball at each other. And when we ask the subject to press a button when black person received the ball, and then press a button and black person throw the ball back to the other guy, then you have a perception that you became like a black person. And by designing the different order of how you show the subject these views, in this time, in one condition, they continuously see the same scenery, or sometimes they switch the scenery back and forth, and also press the button in different conditions. So what, as a total, what the subject received or doing is the same, but we can combine this design, this condition, and this is called 2x2 factorial design, by calculating the brain activity, or more concretely, blood flow accompanying these tasks. We can calculate the brain activity corresponding to the condition that you are viewing yourself from different space and moving around. It's like an out-of-body experience. Looking yourself by your own eye from the different location, objectively. So this is kind of meta self-recognition, and we found this part of the brain, which is this part, is responsible for these functions. So I skipped the slide a little bit, but we recorded those bimodal neurons from parietal cortex. And there is a system called mirror neuron system that codes the action of yourself, like moving around. And this is in this area. And there are other sort of the mode of the self represented in the human brain. I have no time to get into detail, but one is emotional self, or perceptual self, or this is called the Center for Social Self-Understandings, viewing yourself in relation to the others. And it happened to fall into the location where we found the new connections between parietal cortex, where we recorded the neuron from, and the higher, we originally thought the higher visual centers. This new connection I showed you before was newly made by the monkey training. So subtle changes made a lot of differences. And finally, we found, I not have a chance to show you, but prefrontal cortex also makes a connection through the training to this area. So there are different modes of the selves represented in the non-human animals. And this is speculation, but these modes of the selves are functioning independently, depending on the environmental condition that these animals are facing at. they need no more than that. The non-human animals are living in very passively, adapting to the environmental conditions. That's sufficient for them. Doesn't have to go any farther than that. But once these many kinds of self formed a connection in between and united them, it's more self connected to each other, that emerges different sorts of the concept of the self, which is named core self by the psychologist. So this core self is integrating various aspects of yourself, forms some sort of the new concept about yourself. And once this core self is formed, you can observe yourself in the meta self, in the third person view, or objectively. What you realize is that yourself continue over time from the past, present to the future. And what the next kind of the tools, what we want to use is that after acquired motor tools, and on top of that, sensory tools, and using these sensory tools to look back at yourself, you form the core self, extend to the future. What you might want to create is that use the information acquired right now to use it later and store elsewhere, which is the extension of the brain, which is external memory device we're using, or probably in the initial form, it might be the picture or the note that we took. And that's external as a memory device, or external brain. So our environment must have this kind of a structure built in one by one through the evolutionary processes. And once we acquire the concept of the self that continue to the future, then what we think is we design for more comfortable and improved environment, hope for better living in the future. And we start modifying the environment as we want, which non-human animals never do. So why we start doing that is that I didn't talk about this spectrum before. W stands for wild, and I thought it's not fair to think about the human brain and compare with the wild monkeys. If we have to think about our brain function as an organ of the primate, we have to compare with wild humans, not with educated humans. But from the definition, there doesn't exist such a thing as a wild humans. We are not wild. That's why we're humans. I think that's one of the definitions of human beings. So what made it different is that probably something happened during the course of evolution which automatically extend the spectrum, which is not possible in non-human animals, but it could be possible by training. So probably what we have acquired must be the function that we train each other. That is a social stress structure, a social pressure. After acquired meta self-recognition and independent selves, and that's changed the structure of the society structures, and that we start teaching each other, and probably change some tiny bits of genetic code or whatever, epigenetic factors, to that prevent from suppressing the expansion at this level. And we automatically expand it. And that's probably the reason why our spectrum become wider. And I don't have the time to show you here, but we have some evidence that social interactions pressurize this part of the brain and modify its properties. So what I would like to claim here is that during the course of evolution, it's in the natural selection theory, like original species mode of Darwinian theory, is that our evolution have happened by the mutation and also by the natural selection by the change of environment, and which survived becomes more evolved. And this might be true for our hominid ancestors until the level of that time. But after acquired, there is a mechanism called niche construction, which is also proposed by Darwin. This is the one of the function that organisms have. That, like a typical example is earthworm, or maybe more understandable is beaver. Beaver is a mountain kind of rats, but they build a dam, modify the environment, and adapt to that aqueous environment and acquire their own niche and can survive there. And once created a niche, they're satisfied with that. They don't, I never see the improvement, drastic improvement to Beaver Dam, but they are satisfied with that because they don't hope for the better future, probably. But once the human, these buildings are kind of the tools, and we modify the environment, and we always try to improve our environment, ecology, or cities, whatever. And this would pressurize our brain to adapt to that, and then start modifying the environment further by gradually, step by step, building in the new tools, new kind of the tools, until we reach this modern cities and also internet environment and so on. We keep trying it. And that pressurizes our brain again. And this kind of positive feedback suddenly happened probably a few thousand years ago. And that's probably the reason why that the human ancestors stone tool suddenly start developing very rapidly. And we have a reason for that. And I already showed you that there's some microcircuit changes could be induced in a particular part of the brain. And we recently found, this is, by the way, this is ecological niche construction, the first niche construction I would like to introduce you today. And we recently found by structure MRI study, which is called voxel-based morphometry, that during the 2 weeks of training period, monkey parietal cortex actually expand by as much as 23% by MR signal. And nobody knows what this MR signal means, actually. But anyway, we have detected this kind of changes. So experimentally in the lab, we thought we could mimic what has actually happened during evolutionary processes, which is expansion of brain, put more resources into the brain functions. And as I told you, nobody at this date knows what is actually the biological phenomena happening in this expanded brain area. But now I'm trying, this is, I call it a neural niche construction. New resources, pieces of the brain tissue that develop corresponding to new ecological niches. So they start interacting with each other. And we are now introducing the smaller monkey, New World monkey. I come back to this point later, but New World monkey to find out more cellular, concrete biological mechanisms, what is happening in the brain. But this unexpected expansion happened several times in my research, history of my research too. In the beginning, I thought this tiny bits of axonal extension was just the modification of the visual input fed into the parietal cortex. But it happened to be much more than that, to connect different kinds of cells. And this, now I introduced marmoset a few, 2 or 3 years ago, but in the last part of my talk, if I have more time, I would like to show you that marmoset means much more than that. But anyway, so this is the parietal cortex, which expanded most along the course of evolution. If you compare the chimpanzee parietal cortex and human parietal cortex, it's much bigger. And if you also compare with ancestral Australopithecus parietal cortex, it's much larger than chimpanzees here. And this parietal cortex is an interesting part of the brain. This is claimed to be the part of the brain it handles higher cognitive functions, including languages and abstract thoughts and mathematical calculation and so on, which claim to be sits in the supramarginal cortex and also angular gyres of the human brain, which have been expanded, I hope to show you, expanded by 2 years training. And this put more resources to the parietal cortex. And I did some, it's called meta-analysis of the existing literature about functional MRI and monkey neurophysiology, claiming the function of parietal cortex. As I told you, the parietal cortex sits in between somatosensory cortex and visual cortex and auditory cortex. It combines the different modes, the different modalities of information. And this is often claimed that this handles the spatial processing. And this became bigger. The initial claim is that this became bigger because we live in the forest and need some spatial information processing to live in the forest. But there exist many studies that claim that parietal cortex is handling the non-spatial information processing. And I plotted, I'll explain you more in more detail, but also in humans and monkey studies that claiming that parietal cortex is responsible for various non-spatial information processing functions. And I sorted out about hundreds of these studies, but classified very vaguely what kind of spatial structures, although it's not concrete physical space, spatial structure, spatial-like structure that this parietal cortex is handling, and sorted out in 4 classes. One is the perceptual space, handling about attention or working memory or order or number line and so on. And also there are temporal space, which dealing with the time, about the future and past and so on. This is the 4th dimension of physical space. And another interesting feature that the parietal cortex is claimed to be handling is the social space, like objectifying self-other relations and social structures, hierarchies, and so on. This is claimed to be handled by the parietal cortex. And also the conceptual space, like causality or the reasonings or so on. And if you classify it this way, it's become more complicated towards this direction from the actual physical spaces. And then color-coded these studies in different colors and plotted against the parietal cortex. And if actually these kind of the new cognitive functions emerges gradually and in top of these functions, this newly formed supramarginal jazz will handle more higher order of the spatial processing. But it doesn't look like that. It looks like intermingled with each other, although there seems to be some tendency toward the bottom. It actually doesn't happen. So why is it? Is that, as I introduced you earlier, parietal cortex in monkeys and humans sits in between visual, auditory, and somatosensory primary areas, which is the input of the external world to the brain. And parietal cortex sits in between. And what is processed in parietal cortex is spatial organization of the movement in the non-human primates, which is eye movement, hand movement, and head movement. We have to move around your head, eyes, hands, and head in the space. And if you plot this function into the monkey brain, parietal cortex is almost occupied by these transformation of the spatial coordinates. But in the human, if you plotted these functions, they exist corresponding to the non-human primates, these areas that's handling these functions. But there are many rooms, much rooms in between. Probably, as we adapt the principle that more used function or more used area of the brain attain more resources of that, it expands gradually. And this causes the neural niches in between these areas. And this is a neural niche construction. And what is handled by this extra resources or the function is these new non-spatial higher order cognitions. And these should be the cognitive niche construction. And metaphorically, we think logically, the logical structures. We use spatial metaphors. We bridge ideas, something sitting in behind, the principle underlying the everything, or build up the new concept on top of that. That's full of these spatial metaphors. Probably by reusing these existing neural functions and to stabilize these existing functions, we put more resources in that. And once we attain more resources, bigger, more resources, that emerges the different functions. And that will be the cognitive niche construction. And so what I would like to claim is that from the pure natural selection, we created this niche construction, positive feedback loop, and this could be accelerated more and more by this triadic niche construction, which is comprised of ecological niche, neural niche, and cognitive niches. And this evolution or development might not just handled by the genomic mutations, could be handled. The information could be embedded in the environment, like tools or structures built in the environment. That would affect to the expression of the genes through the extragenomic or epigenetic processes, or through the EBO-DEBO processes. We modify our phenotype to reflect the information embedded in the environment. That might be the mechanism that actually happened and skyrocketed our speed after these few thousands of years. And I would like to illustrate this mechanism. And it's on the way, so I cannot tell you, but probably in a few years I would like to tell you that what we have found. And I didn't have a time, so I didn't go through. I went through very quickly, but this was just published last month in Royal Society about this triadic misconstruction idea. So if you have some interest in that, please download. This is free access, so download it and read it. And then in the last few, do I have 5 more minutes? Then I just would like to, something we discovered very recently, actually a few weeks ago. The marmoset monkeys meant more than we expected. It's more than just elucidated the new actual cell biological processes of the brain expansion. We found it more than that, is that if you think about evolution, the neuroscientists often make the mistake that if you compare the human with apes or old monkeys or new world monkeys, these are evolutionally older than, or low, or neuroscientists usually use the expression of the lower primates. But it's not true. For the evolutional scientists, I think it's common for you that we have to think this way. It might represent evolutionary precursors or in common ancestors, but these animals have their own evolutionary traits. And it's not just our primitive ancestors. And this is simply wrong. And what I want to claim is that we have to look about the interaction of the environment, of the past history. And in that context, we have to think about the human brain functions, which represent our intelligence. And I don't want to preach you about this, but I have to just to remind you about what homology, analogy, and convergent evolution is. The homology is derived from the common ancestors' common genetic code to produce the different phenotypes, but originated from the common genetic code. Analogy is usually by convergent evolution. It looks similar, but derived from different reasons or different genetic systems. Like the typical example is, these are sharks, fish, and this is ancestral reptile, and this is dolphin. They're completely different branches, but looks like the same because too much to the environment, interaction with the environment. They have evolved this way. But the life is not that simple. There must be homology plus extinction, or there was a re-evolution. There's many kind of things happening during the course of evolution. We have to look carefully about this. And what we have found is that marmoset, this is a new world monkeys. And using that, I thought I have to observe it directly in their ecological habitat. I actually went to Brazil 2 months ago and observed many interesting traits of the marmoset. And that included many different behavior from old world monkeys or apes that common with human behaviors, like vocal communication, cooperative behavior, altruistic behavior to help others, and many others. And what we first try to examine is that maybe in the new world monkeys preserves human-specific trait that have been extincted in the old world. The reason is this. This is the evolutionary tree of the, I'm sorry for this Japanese expression, it's similar in English here, but our, here's ape. The humans and old world monkey were differentiated about 20 million years ago. And new world monkeys and old world monkeys and ape are differentiated about 35 million years ago. And what is happening, I have focused here, is that this ancestor has emerged somewhere here. It's called Laurasia continent. And at the Gondwana continent, differentiated. New World monkey trait travel like this, and Old World monkey evolved like this. And in the Old World, which is in Africa and Asia, including here, we have Old World monkeys and apes. And in this trait, the first Old World monkey didn't exist. There's a trait of the apes evolved much larger than Old World monkeys, and they differentiate here. So probably in the niches, it's not just a natural habitat. Other species, related species, is also part of the ecological niches. And my guess here was that since the Old World monkeys and apes and humans evolved interacting with each other for a long time in the Old World, maybe the human along with the human being acquiring the human-specific trait in other species, other primates, those traits might have been suppressed. And that's the reason why it's difficult to find the human-specific functions in apes or Old World monkeys. But since the New World monkeys have differentiated a long time and they evolved independently without humans, the human invaded the new continent only recently, very recently in terms of the evolutionary time scope. So they might have preserved in the different ways in the many kinds of New World monkeys, might have fragmentarily have the human-specific trait. And what I have focused here is the vocal communication, and which is lacking in apes or very rare in Old World monkeys. But New World monkeys have very rich vocal communication accompanying the social behavior. And we analyzed, this is a very precursor work, it's not published yet, the 14 kinds of language-specific genes, and by clustering them. And we just acquired the full sequence of the marmoset and compared in the 6 kinds of primates with these language-related genes, along with humans, 3 kinds of apes, and rhesus monkeys, which is Old World monkeys and marmosets. And surprisingly, we found that marmoset is closest to human in 9 out of 14 these language-specific genes, probably due to the convergent evolution that I have described right now. They have evolved interacting with each other and other species in the New World and the environment without humans. So they have preserved some human-specific trait. So if we design the experiment very carefully, we might be able to find a very ideal animal model to study this human-specific function. This is very precursory data, so I just wanted to show you the flavor of that. But this marmoset, introduction to the marmoset monkey meant much more than I have expected before. And this is an evolution of my study. But anyway, I would like to conclude my talk by raising the concept of the triadic niche construction, which is part of the complexity system, and assign the human's brain as only a part of the very broad ecosystem, and it interacts with each other, and that might represent the evolutionary mechanisms. And I would like to end my talk by thanking to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Now we have time for questions.
That was a fascinating presentation. So I'm going to ask you to do something you may be unwilling to do, which is to speculate on the future. If you're right, then you seem to imply that we've seen evolution of human cognitive functions within the lifespan of human civilization, and as our specific niches have evolved. Given that there are many more of us today than there were, say, 5,000 years ago or 10,000 years ago, and that there are therefore many more opportunities to experience an ever more elaborate and differentiated set of niches, what conclusion might you draw on the future of human evolution? In the New York Times Sunday, they had an article, "Are we becoming more stupid?" So what would you say about the future of human cognition, given all the kinds of cognitive tools that we have and carry around with us now and connect us in new ways?
So, well, we cannot predict and spot what is actually happening. But what we don't want to do is to put the very simple binary axis, which is good or which is bad. It happens, it's a fact. And it's valueless, it's a neutral. And what we can predict or try to predict is applying the complexity system. We can, well, everything happens unexpectedly and have several multiple meaning of the one function. And when one of the new meaning that derived from unexpected function, if it's useful, it expands. That's evolution. So what we can do right now is applying the complexity theory and try to find out what could happen in the near future and what would happen that, and probably select back in right now and expand it. So in this sense, the causality flips back. Usually we think, I think that would be a topic of discussion, that we think that something past causes the result right now, and something exists right now is a cause of the future. But we think then differently applying the complexity system. Probably the future is a cause of what should be selected right now. I haven't deepened this thought yet, but this will revolutionize, will completely change the way of thinking and what is actually happening. And I'm very much interested in that. This is my expect or my hope for this complexity studies to expand. This might not be an answer, but it's unexpected, but there must be the way to find the path. This could be the answer to your question?
Well, you might have multiple scenarios of evolution, different ways, different possible pathways, and given the variety of, just looking around the room, the variety of human beings that we are evident, you would see different possible human evolutions given different contexts. Isn't that right?
Yes, but that's what my way of thinking. And then what reflects me directly is that, could it be science? Science, natural science, have to be reproducible and falsifiable. And I think yesterday we thought about there might be the principle of the history. The history is path dependent. When it happened, and although there's alternative paths, it extinguishes once it happens. And it could be applied for the future. And then if I want to push forward seriously, I might have to revise the concept of the natural science itself. And I'm not sure. I don't want to speak much further than that, but I'm aware of that possibility, but I don't have a solution yet.
I have two fairly simple technical questions. First one is, where does it fit in when monkeys or people use other individuals as tools? Because in social interaction, the child will ask the mother to get the ice cream instead of getting the ice cream herself. So that's one question. And the other question is about when monkeys or humans learn new tricks, not in evolutionary timescale, but in individual timescale. You have a new niche being constructed, but what is lost? Basically, the resources going to the new niche don't go to other activities we might have had. So is there a trade-off?
Well, the first question, that exists precursorily in old wild monkeys too. There's an anecdotal observation published in Japanese macaque. There's evidence is this. There's a pipe, a very small pipe that the mother cannot get into. Then what she did is she pushed her baby into the pipe and grab the food, and after he took it out, she ate it. So that's this mother, Japanese macaque, used her baby as a tool. And this kind of thing never happened in old world monkeys. But this is another story. But that's a precursor.
Where does it fit in the hierarchy that you drew? I mean, you drew a hierarchy from inactive towards symbolic representation. Is using others higher or lower? Because it's basically something fairly primitive that a lot of sort of primitive monkeys can do.
Yeah, probably that depends on how to use the others. If you drive the others to favor of yourself, that's very highly sophisticated, like a Machiavellian tactics. And this needs I think this is just a speculation. This needs ability to objectify you and others and make equivalence of them and make use of that. This is needs a very higher cognitive functions. And this is much higher than symbolic. And even the humans need the training to do that properly. But in this pipe and mother monkeys like kind of usage of the others as a tool, needs a much lower, maybe passive, just understanding of the natural rules. So there's variations. And the second question, the trade-off theory, I haven't done it myself, but it's claimed on my colleague using chimpanzees, is that they have more instantaneous visual memory. I don't want to go further, but like in autistic patients have that kind of ability. But once acquired how to use language, then we lose that trait and we try to understand it with language, and our memory capacity seems to shrink. It's a visual memory. So that's kind of trade-off. And with that trade-off, what we attain is to make the world more structuralized or logical. And that gives you more capacity to handle more complex things. But just to handle the immediate memory, immediate information, that we lost it. And there's another interesting experiment. I'm not sure about it, but if you block the Broca's area, language area, by transmagnetic stimulation, and that changes how you draw the picture. With the language, we draw a picture very symbolically, but with in the caveman's picture, in the primitive, that's very visual, and it's more concrete. If you block block the language area, that person become more visual and more concrete. And while it's come back to the other, the original, more abstract picture. So that's just anecdotal, experimental evidence, but I think that those represent those trade-off that you just raised.
Okay, thank you.
I haven't done it myself, so I cannot claim from my data that the evidence exists.
So this is really just a curious question. You said when you trained the monkey, you saw a growth in the prefrontal cortex, which means they're acquiring more resources. So did they need more food? Did their metabolism go up as their capacity increased?
Yeah, there's many theories about it. I haven't done myself, but probably we need more food, and that's why we start cooking. The cooking can pick out more resources, more energy, and more. It can make use of the food resources more efficiently, much more efficiently, and that's must be necessary for our brain to expand. Oh, I see. That we don't know. Well, the training itself is eating the food, and well, it's maybe different from what you have asked, but the fat monkeys learn quicker. And the reason is to train the monkey, the reward is a food. So they have to being trained a lot. So if they eat less, the number of the training we can apply becomes lesser and needs more time. And once the monkey becomes fatter, more gain the weight, properly gain the weight, they eat more and they can train more. It's become much quicker. So that's evidence I have, but I don't think it's related to metabolism. So it's just a matter of the amount of they eat.
Hello. I'll ask you a little bit more philosophical question, maybe mundane. See, resource substitution and resource growth are two different aspects. And what you say started with by saying that this guy had the good bicep means a stronger muscle is a classic case of resource substitution. So there are studies, actually, I came into a study that wrestlers have less mathematics score. It is not surprising, it's a resource substitution case, So brain is also doing resource substitution. You were talking about some aspects of resource substitution and some aspect of resource growth. So you are mentioning, basically in your talk, it's kind of implicit, not explicit, at least to me, that some resource substitutions trigger growth. that might be it. That, when you do certain resource substitution, you actually trigger resource growth. Certain resource substitution might not trigger resource growth, but there are aspects, there are subsets of these activities that actually, when you substitute to that activity, you might actually trigger growth, which means overall your ability grows. So one check will be, say in your cases, when the monkeys get trained, did they lose some of their monkeyness? If you characterize something like a monkeyness, which is very basic skill of monkeys, and when you train them into finer elements, the resource substitution is essentially losing monkeyness and putting more attention to these skills that they need to acquire food. One is growth. The growth means they'll keep the monkeyness intact, but they learn this new skill. That's resource growth. Have you thought about this in your experiments at all?
Not yet, but this is a very important point. I didn't think about the resource attribution too much to now. But as you pointed out, is all about resource growth. But about the resource attribution, it's similar to what you have pointed out, the trade-off. And about the monkeyness, that I don't know. But probably we see monkeyness as non-humanness. And the trained monkey become more humanness, attain more humanness. Probably that loses more monkeyness, but it's just a story. But resource attribution, I have to think about that. Thank you very much for pointing that out.
So, building on the question, you say that the tools is something lower and easier than, for instance, using others as tools. However, there are quite a few people that claim that it is actually the social environment that promote the embodiment. And this is further sustained by the fact that there are animals that, despite the fact they cannot use tools, they have a very good social structure. So for instance, bees, they use other bees to communicate. So I would like your viewpoint, if whether the social environment actually promoted embodiment before the tools.
Yeah, if you talk about the social environment, social structures, I think it's very different between species, among species. The human social structures are different from monkey social structures, and also for ant and bees, and there's many social animals. But as bees, they use others as a tool, but they don't use in purpose. I think they don't think about the future, and it's some sort of automatically, it's a mechanism built into their social structures. And I didn't talk much about how we objectify ourselves and we make the equivalence of ourselves. The human social structure is very different from non-human one, probably due to the connections in the brain. And I think it's difficult to compare the social structure of ants and bees with humans because they have very different brain structures. We might be able to compare human and non-human primate social structure, and then we can do the meaningful discussion. But I will say that the human social structure is very different from non-human and non-human primate social structure in terms of how you make equivalence of others and yourself, and how you objectify yourself. And for more to say, for non-human animals, non-human primates, which doesn't have the self-objectification process, other animals or other individuals are one kind of environmental factors. It's not equivalent to yourself standing in front of you. It's other source of information that you acquire as to be useful for environment. So like if you think about the mirror, are you familiar with the mirror neuron story? There's our neurons that respond to your own action, say like picking this bottle, and also to the others picking the bottle. And I think it's not, it does not, the slide is gone, but it doesn't represent others are picking the food as equivalent to yourself. if somebody else picked this food and eat it, it means that this could be eatable. So that's a part of the information of the environment that you acquire using other as one element of that. So I think that is the social, well, so to say, social structure in non-human primates. It looks like resemble to the human social structure because they look like us, but it's completely different. And I have to deepen my thought further to answer your question, but I would see there's some differences. And I have to be a bit careful about talking about similar function of other species. We tend to project us to others, but it's...
Let's say to compare, let's say that the environmental pressure, the social pressure, made any kind of species, for any kind of species, made it necessary to separate self from others. So, for instance, you know that there are birds that use other species, so we even have cross-species
Yes.
exchanges. So, I don't compare, I'm just saying that whether...
Well, I have to think about it. The immunology system compares self and others and make a relation with that. And there's many aspects of self and others in many different systems. So I would be very careful about it. And I'm sorry, I cannot answer immediately what you have asking.
So you talk about the humans being wild as being almost a contradiction, right? But there are a few cases of feral humans raised in the wild or in barns and things like that, that grow up to maybe age 12. And I don't know the details of all these cases, and I know there aren't that many cases. But have you looked at them to see where they are on the developmental chain and how much maybe that indicates what training is required to get us, like language ability? I know the feral humans don't have any language ability. And even after they're joined to society, have difficulty learning language. But I don't know the details. This is not my research.
I don't know the detail either. There are a few reports about that, but it's not so well controlled under the aspect of what I am interested in. They must be controlled by those researchers' interest. It's not sufficient to claim other factors. And there are some reports, but I cannot make any, say, description out of that in linking with my studies. I have to be very careful about that. And there are some interesting evidence and stories, indeed, but I think that's the conditions right now.
Okay, I have a similar question, MB3. So you have showed that the monkey can be trained to a higher level. So why in the past millions of years they have not been trained? Or they have been trained, they just cannot pass to the next generation? What's the reason? You talk about a social pressure. So why monkey didn't evolved as a human?
Oh, you are asking why the monkey didn't train themselves?
Yes.
Among themselves?
Yeah, in the past.
Well, probably their social or ecological niches or conditions didn't allow that. But it was not beneficial for those ancestral species to train each other. That's my explanation. For example, if the baby monkeys imitate their mothers, but they stop imitation. Well, imitation is one of the learning mechanisms. They stop imitation when they grow up to a certain level of development. Probably the reason why is that if you imitate carelessly, it might damage your life. And you'll be killed by imitating the superior monkeys, hierarchical higher monkeys. But that's one example. So once they have been adapted and acquired ability to adapt to that particular niche, it's no need to risk the safety conditions they already attained. So they don't develop further. And we are grown-up kids. We risk our safety. And the social structures or legal system securing those risks. That's why we are allowed to challenge or think for a better future. Primitive non-human primates probably didn't have that security, and it's better for them to be satisfied with their own attained conditions. That's why they didn't develop further. That's my explanation.
Any evidence?
Evidence, that's difficult. It's again, matter of the science of the history and science of evolution. For evidence, I'm not sure. But if you can speculate, let's talk like evidence from what I have just talked. It's not beneficial for them to go any further.
I'm just curious, if the monkey got trained, so will their next generation be easier to train to the same level?
So what do you mean by
If one monkey
humans? One monkey?
had been trained, so will it be easier for their next generation to be trained to the same level?
We have to think about that. That's not that simple. Actually, we once tried to, well, we attempted, and it's not proved yet. That's a formation of the culture. It's another aspect of the monkey society, and that could be done. But again, you have to come back to the definition of the culture and evolution and so on. It's a difficult story.
Yeah, that is true.
I cannot claim immediately. That's an interesting point, but I cannot make an immediate claim for that.
Yeah. I thought this was fascinating, not just as a complex issue in itself, but also because of the implications for our own understanding and appreciation of greater complexity as humans evolve. I was curious, I know speculation is difficult, but I was curious whether you've had any preliminary unsubstantiated thoughts so far about how you would go about training humans to expand our own parietal cortexes.
Oh, we are doing it all the time. Playing video games and making puzzles, and that's a part of the education system.
In fact, if I understood correctly what you were saying, we've kind of saturated in that sense. I mean, it may be we do other things, of course, but we've saturated in terms of what you could do.
Yeah, that's difficult to claim. It looks like as if we are being saturated, but who knows? But with the internet or brain-machine interface story, we can connect with each other externally, and that might overcome that saturation. That's one possibility, one of many possibilities. And I don't know if it's a good or bad, but it might happen. It's make us phase transitions. Well, if we could try, somebody is doing, I think, actually already. So that's a precursory study about expecting the future, and we need a feedback if it's good or bad, and to choose it. I think maybe you are doing already.
On behalf of the NTU Complexity Program, I'd like to present a token of appreciation to Professor Iriki. Thank you very much.